Hi everybody, this is Nikki again. I'm here with a video that is my personal experience. Some personal opinion, probably more than I need to do. Not to be used as medical advice and only to be kind of thrown back into your big pot of things to consider, along with your own stuff and your own stuff. Okay, so anyway, I wanted to do a video today on 4 hours that I spent in auto mode a couple weeks ago. For some of you guys that kind of watch these videos, you might know that I'm not in auto mode currently. I'm trying to kind of regroup and try to go back in again, better equipped. But in the meantime, I'm popping in from here to, here and there to figure out some of what it's doing, with some success. So I'm looking forward to going back in, but not until I do these things. Okay, so anyway, so I was in auto mode for 4 hours the other day, and you can say crazy or not crazy. This is okay, anyway, I'll deal with that in a minute. But I tested my blood sugar for 4 hours every 5 minutes so that I could have the BG that went with the ICIG, the calibration factor, and the SG, for a very good reason. There's a lot of stuff I'm looking at, but that's but what I really wanted to do is look at the comparison between the SG and the BG and how auto mode, whether or not auto mode is able to use my blood sugar in order to make good decisions, because that's kind of my problem in the past, is that auto mode is the sensor is delayed for me because I have a fast moving blood sugar, and because it's delayed, it's sometimes making inappropriate treatment decisions for me as in regards to whether or not I need insulin. So 4 hours in auto mode. The first thing I want to show you from my phone to this, because that's as high tech as it comes. This was that day in auto mode. So right here, there was, that's manual mode. I entered at 10:23, I think. So that first piece was a minimum delivery, and then there was micro boluses and a small minimum delivery and micro boluses. And you can look at the line. Okay, so that's where I went in. I went in at 85. I'll give you guys some information in a second. Here's another picture. I don't know if you guys can actually see that or not. At this point, it's pretty solid micro boluses, a couple where I didn't receive any, but you can see my line. Everything looks like it's under 150, and that was up until 130, and then here was the last one, and this takes me up until 230, at which point I exited, and that was gone. So I hope you saw that. Okay, so I don't know if you noticed the line, but by all appearances, it looked like 4 really good hours in auto mode, and in fact, that's what some of the comments were that I got in my Facebook group was, looks great. I would call it a successful 4 hours. If that were real, then I would also call it a successful 4 hours, but there was more going on behind the scenes than what we could see by that, which I think is often the case with this. So this is what I'll tell you. First of all, when I make these videos, it's not to convince anybody that if they're in love with auto mode and they're doing really well, it's not to convince them that they shouldn't be, because that's great. It's to help people who aren't, to try to identify to try to identify what might be behind it, because some of the things, maybe it's a matter of just keeping an eye on. Okay, anyway, basically Sunday morning, the information that you need to know, at random I decided to enter auto mode. The only thing that was pertinent to the 4 hours was that it was day 5 of my sensor. Day 5 is not a strong day for me at all. In fact, day 5, I often change it because of some stuff that I see. So it was day 5. That's not going to be its strength. I had just finished a coffee about 30 minutes prior to entering auto mode. Coffee does make me rise. I did have insulin on board to cover it, so normally I wouldn't have worried about it, but I do know there's probably going to be a little rise from the coffee. I also had 1 unit on board, which, as I said, should have been sufficient to cover it. And my starting BG was an 85. I entered auto mode, sorry, not 10:23, but I entered auto mode at 10:07 a.m. and exited at 2:21 p.m., so just over 4 hours. Okay, also noteworthy before I tell you how it all unfolded is the fact that during my stay in auto, I did not eat anything, not one thing in 4 hours. I also didn't eat anything going into it, just the coffee 30 minutes before. And my activity level was this, and I don't do that very often, but that's what I was doing. I was sitting and testing, taking notes, chatting with kids, chatting with my mom, and moving from chair to chair, basically. So it was no activity, no food. So as far as effect for cause, I guess, for what could have been making my blood sugar rise, that was none of that. Okay. I think that was it. Okay, so I showed you my picture. All right, so here's the quick summary. I entered auto mode at 10:07 with a BG of an 85. I can't find my notes right now, but my SG was about 4 or 5 points off. So I think I entered at an 85. I think my SG was like maybe an 81 or something, right? So they were very close. I left auto mode just about 4 hours and 20 minutes later with an SG of a 138. Okay, so I entered SG of 81, 82, entered at a 138. Everything looked pretty even, looked uneventful, that it was relatively successful. But here is what actually was happening. The very first observation, when I entered auto mode and calibrated, I calibrated with a BG of an 85. I entered that value into my pump. Interestingly enough, my SG never picked up higher than a 76. So small difference, but because this thing is using all these numbers in order to determine microboluses, it actually is kind of a big difference, right? There's 6 points difference there. 9 points difference. Yeah, 9 points difference there. So it was showing me as being lower. So with the fresh calibration of an 85, my SG never picked up more than a 76. At 10:15, my SG dropped to a 73. My first blood sugar finger stick was a 113. So my SG showed a small drop, while in actuality my BG rose quite a bit. And again, an immediate split between SG and BG straight out of a calibration. 10:23, my SG was a 75, my BG was a 120. At 10:29, my SG was an 86 and my BG was a 131. So 22 minutes after calibrating, my SG finally reflected that number I had at calibration. But in the meantime, my BG had risen almost 50 points. Also noteworthy, during this entire period, I did not receive any microboluses despite a rising BG. There's that delay, At 10:34, with an SG of 90 and a BG of 131, I see my first microbolus of 0.075 after accumulating 30 minutes of minimum delivery. The point difference, I think I'm just going to read this. Okay, that point difference had held fairly consistently for about an hour, seeing a slow convergence of the two numbers. But what was auto doing during that time? The SG was between 25 to 40 points off my BG. It was not as harmless as just being a misleading number. It was also delivering a reduced rate. For the second 30 minutes of my first hour, I received a mixture of very small micros between 0.025 and 0.075, with a few missed micros. In total, in my first hour in auto mode, I received the equivalent of a 14% temp basal. In other words, I received just 14% of my pre-programmed basal rate in manual mode. So in 1 hour of auto, where my blood sugar was starting at an 85, I received 14% of my manual mode basal, had I been in manual mode. Okay, so my second hour went better, yielding a much higher insulin rate of 94% of what I would have received in manual mode. In the second hour, I was still looking at a slightly lower range of SG values, so much better on the insulin, but the range was still showing lower. My SG values were 104 to 143, when in actuality, my BG values were 131 to 154. But the micros being delivered were still appropriate. We're still at an appropriate amount. Sorry. But we can't forget about that 14% that I started with the first hour. So even though this one I got 94%, I'm heading into the third hour with 1 hour of 14%. Okay. My third hour was less impressive. Although the range tightened somewhat with an SG range of 123 to 138 and a BG range of 136 to 155, the sensor's difficulty with providing a good SG value caused, again, the decrease in microbolus size. With a mix of microbolus size 0.025 to 0.1, auto mode delivered to me a very disappointing 62% of my manual mode basal rate during this time. However, it's not only that auto mode is shying away from the insulin again, but that it did it at a time, again, that my BG was continuing to rise. With a BG coasting at near 150 and little insulin left on board, I definitely needed my insulin. Auto mode heading into the fourth hour still didn't recognize that. My fourth hour was kicked off with a mix of 3.025 microboluses with 2 missed micros, just 0.075 of the 0.5 I should have received that far into the hour. My SG range continued to lag with a 111 to 155, while my BG range was actually a 136 to 184. That lagging SG probably contributed to auto mode continuing to deliver a less than ideal amount of insulin for the first 30 minutes. Even as auto mode finally recognizing a rise, dished out larger micros through the last 30 minutes, it was too little too late as my BG had reached a 184. During the fourth hour, I received just 60% of my regular pre-programmed manual mode basal rate. So although at 184 might not seem like something worth freaking out over, with a 184 and a total of 4 hours at an overall insulin delivery rate of just 57.5% of my regular insulin rates is a scary prospect. And again, no food, right? Like I hadn't actually eaten, there were no carbs behind any of that. If you just looked at my graph screen from that period, as you saw, you would never guess all that was happening behind it. Maybe you would also be really surprised at say, 3:30 when your BG was a 265, but you hadn't eaten anything. So I don't know if you guys have done that, but that was the case for me in auto mode. Even if you do know to check your graph screen and had checked it for minimum delivery, you would have seen very little. The majority of that time was dotted pink, giving the appearance of regular insulin. However, many of those micros were quite small, and a collection of them is like a temp basal. Again, I did not eat anything or engage in any kind of physical activity during this time. In fact, the only thing I did during this period was test my BG almost every 5 minutes for a total of 50 times so that I could observe auto mode and try to understand this decision. The last thing I'll say is this. My last 2 readings were mind-boggling. At 2:23 p.m. with an SG of a 138, which I mentioned, and a true BG of a 180, I received a micro of 0.05. That's very small and not particularly impressive given the rise I was experiencing. At 2:43, I tested one last time after I had left auto mode. My SG had dropped down from a 138. It dropped unexpectedly to a 119. I don't know why. When I tested my BG, it was a 177. So it reflected that drop. It just reflected it from the wrong starting number. I exited auto mode, set up my suspend on low, gave myself a correction bolus, and then exercised to try to help the high. Longest video yet. Thanks for watching.